Hi, everybody. This is Kyle again, coming to you with this week's video lecture. This week we're on week 5, coming to the Renaissance is our new time period between 1450 and 1600. Just a quick review of what we did last week, and actually I'll try to pull this up full screen. Hey, there we go. It worked. So, just a quick review of last week. We looked at the medieval period lasting between 450 and 1450, a big, hefty 1,000 year period. We had developments in music notation at this point, developments in harmony going from kind of your one line chant all the way to like polyphony. And performance practice. So we talked about the difference between the secular church vocal, mostly music, and then the more instrumental troubadour style music. We talked about what was going on in China and how they were kind of adopting traditions from their like neighboring countries and neighboring. I guess we would call them not communities, but neighboring nations. Sorry, I don't know why that took me so long to figure out. But just the other nations around them, the other societies that were going on around them, there's all sorts of stuff. And so they said, well, these guys have very interesting things going on. Why don't we learn from them? And so they ended up with a super diverse list of instruments and styles that were all kind of under one umbrella. We also learned of the ceremonial and religious significance of the instruments in the Americas and in Latin America, and kind of what was going on down there. So the Renaissance, a much smaller 150-year period of time. It's not the huge 1,000 years that we looked at before. It's just 150 years, but a lot happened in this 150 years. So basically in the Renaissance period, we start to see music in modes. So music starts to use scales, and have like more harmonic structure than it did before. We see richer textures, so 4 or more parts all at the same time, rather than just one vocal line or 2 vocal lines or possibly 3. And we also start to hear harmony that has kind of a greater concern for flow, for chord progression, and this plays into the modes, right? If we have a scale, now we can play around with how we group those notes in the scale, and we can end up with chords and chord progressions. All the information for the Renaissance in your book is on between pages 69 and 75, but I'm going to go over most of it here, and as well some additional things, just like last week, that aren't included in the book, but that I think are worth knowing, because again, music never took place just in one spot on the planet. It's a human endeavor, and we're all doing it all the time, and it's something that it seems that most human societies have either at least engaged with in some way or have deep traditions that they've developed. So I think it's worth exploring some of the ones outside of Europe. So rebirth, the word Renaissance means rebirth in French, and it really was. If we're thinking about the years leading up to the Renaissance, we're thinking about the bubonic plague, we're thinking about the Hundred Years' War, and so all these things come to an end, and we see the rebirth that is the Renaissance, and so there's new art coming out of it. People are able to focus on more than just survival. And if we see anything across human development, it's that when people have more free time, we tend to get more art or more inventions. Society tends to take bigger leaps as people are more free with their time. It's generally agreed that the Renaissance started in Florence, Italy, at least in Europe. As a cultural movement, it's affected subjects such as art, politics, science, religion, literature, philosophy, and of course music. So we're in good company here. Lots of development was happening in academia at the time, and music is just one of the many areas that saw these developments. So it was a really interesting time. In theory and notation, according to Margaret Bent, a noted musicologist, she says Renaissance notation is under prescriptive by our standards, which translates into modern. When translating into modern form, it requires a prescriptive weight that over-specifies and distorts its original openness. Um, Basically, again, we still didn't have completely standard notation, and if we try to translate a lot of Renaissance music into our like modern context or into like our modern 5-line staff, we lose some of what makes it what it is. We also have a different tuning system now, so they didn't tune their pitches the same way we tune our pitches. And if you listen to historically informed players, you'll notice that the sounds they create do tend to have a strange openness. And I think that is in large part due to the fact that some of their intervals were further apart than our intervals are today. And so many recreations of this music that you'll hear today are just, it's just not what the people heard back in this time. And it's just because our sensibilities have really changed. It's a whole different system from what we're used to. But there are opportunities out there for you to go to concerts of people who engage in historically informed practice, people who spend their lifetimes trying to recreate music as it was in this time. I think that's a really valuable enterprise because it's almost like being able to transport your ear back, hundreds of years. So all that is to say, most modern recreations of Renaissance music just are not the same as what the people on the ground would have heard at that time. Important forms, we have the madrigal and the motet. The madrigal was the most important secular vocal form of its time, invented by the Italians in the 1500s. It was adopted by the French, notably, and other Europeans later. These pieces were written for small groups of singers and were used for court entertainment. The number of voices ranged from 3 to 8. Most madrigals dealt with subjects such as nature and love and religious devotion. The madrigal fell out of popularity when opera emerged as the preferred form of vocal entertainment. The madrigal can be thought of as an extension of the troubadour or the Minne singer or Meister singer tradition from the previous era. So it is a style of a cappella singing where you have a group of people and they sing about these different subjects. There's also lots of word painting that goes on. Much of it is very romantic, would have been used to woo a courtly lady, possibly. Some of it is somewhat religious, but we mostly get our religious works from our motets. The motet is defined as a piece of music in several parts with words, but many times motets were used for religious purposes. The motet was a very popular form during the Renaissance. The motet included polyphonic settings, imitative counterpoint, and sacred text in Latin. Secular motets were written, but that's kind of a loose definition. Every once in a while, a monarch would want to have a motet written about them, and as monarchs, would like, they often had texts set about how they were the chosen of God, and they were the one meant to be ruling, and it is through the grace of God that the subjects of the land should be so lucky to have this monarch ruling them. So I think it's a little loose that we would really call those motets, but I think many composers were probably pressured to write that sort of music. If there's some examples you can listen to in your own time, they're both really great. The one on the left is the same listening example that your book recommends, and the one on the right is some lovely Palestrina, one of my favorites. Speaking of Palestrina, Giovanni da Palestrina lived roughly from 1525 to 1594. He was born in Palestrina, Giovanni da Palestrina, a small town near Rome, musically educated in Rome. Very interesting figure. We have a lot of Palestrina's music still, or considering a lot, still left around, considering this person was alive almost 500 years ago. And he worked as a bishop, as a choir master in a local church, And later, when the bishop of that church was elevated to pope in 1553, he remembered Palestrina and all of Palestrina's great work and brought him along to the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. Palestrina wrote some number of secular madrigals, but he is most noted for his sacred vocal music. So there are some madrigals, some more worldly, secular music out there, but it's mostly the sacred music that we know. Palestrina is known today as an early master of counterpoint and polyphonic texture. If you ever are part of a choir, or if you really enjoy singing, Palestrina is just like such a great experience to perform. All the moving lines, it really does fill this great gap between your pre-polyphonic kind of organum, imitative part writing, and then what we start to see later in the Baroque era. I think he is in large part the Renaissance to me when I think of the Renaissance. Josquin des Prés, another very notable figure, although different than Palestrina, we don't know nearly as much about Mr. des Prés. Born in France, but spent most of his life in Italy, particularly in Rome. Remember we mentioned that the Renaissance, really the kind of tradition it came out of was very much an Italian tradition. Very popular during his life and considered to be one of the leading composers of the time, but we just don't know much about his personal life. Music printing was a very new thing at this time, and also a very expensive thing at this time, and so often only the richest folks were getting access to new printed material, and only the most educated could read it or decipher it to begin with, and so it was pretty notable that Josquin had multiple copies of his music printed in multiple years. That just goes to show like what a popular guy he was. And then if we shoot over to the UK for a minute, we have Thomas Morley, known for writing English madrigals and keyboard music especially. He lived during Shakespeare's time and was the organist at St. Paul's Cathedral. That's a pretty big job to have. He was the most famous composer of secular music in Elizabethan England. So we're talking in England here, but he was the most popular at the time. We know that he went to Oxford, and we know that he and Robert Johnson are the composers of the only surviving contemporary settings of verse by Shakespeare. So that's kind of cool to see this collaboration going on between one of the most notable figures in English language history period with Shakespeare and Thomas Morley. So those settings are pretty interesting to listen to. He was also involved in music publishing, which, as I mentioned at the time, was kind of a new thing, this idea of publishing music and putting out copies of music. This was quite the endeavor. And he is noted for developing his own style of printing music. If we shoot over to China, the Ming Dynasty fills basically the entirety of the Renaissance period in Europe, but following the collapse of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, the Ming Dynasty restored order to China and expanded royal power. During this period in history, China was arguably the global superpower. However, starting in the 15th century, China became increasingly isolationist. Musically, the most active styles were the theater music styles and instrumental pieces. So we know that China, after having this huge army and all these wars and the dynasties turning over and finally being able to settle the majority of what we know as modern-day China, we know that I've heard different accounts, but some of the accounts I've said is basically that they had everything they needed. They didn't need to trade with anybody because they controlled so much territory. They could get everything they wanted or needed. They could acquire themselves. They had no use for trading with outside people, and so there was this isolation that we saw, cut off from trading with other groups. I mean, this might have been brought on maybe by the bubonic plague scare that happened in Europe. I know I wouldn't want any part of that. But so that's what we see going on in the Ming Dynasty. The first thing that we have here is the Kung Fu opera. Also, I apologize for my pronunciation. I am doing my very best, but we have Kung Fu opera. This is a more aristocratic form of theater than previous iterations. Kung Fu is the oldest existent form of Chinese opera. This style dominated Chinese theater from 16th century to the 18th century. The major instruments were the horizontal flute and the notched vertical flute. The sheng, which is a really awesome mouth organ. It's like it reminds me of like a if you mixed the European organ and a harmonica together, you would get this instrument. It's super cool. I recommend looking into it. And the pipa, which is kind of this like plucked lute that you like lay on a table in front of you. So all of these were accompanying the vocals in this style. The vocal style of Kung Fu matched the soft accompaniment. So it was soft, and it was subtle, and was usually accompanying kind of like a male singing falsetto. Today these parts are played by females, but at the time it wasn't unusual to have a male in falsetto playing some of these parts. Kung Fu has been listed as one of the masterpieces of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity by UNESCO back in 2001. All right, next off we have the Yang Qing Ang. I'll try that one more time. The Yang Qing Ang is a different style of opera, and I think this is a cool foil to the Kung Fu that we listened to last time, or we just spoke about, because it is a generally it was made for the general population, so this wasn't like your aristocratic style. This was the style of musical theater for everybody, and it was more appealing, and I think one of the reasons it was is because it used a chorus, and so there were lots of people on stage singing, making very loud, joyful noise, and in addition to the soloist. And there's also these explanatory passages in colloquial speech in between the lines of classical poetry. So if you can imagine, most of the dialogue and the poetry that was going on stage was in this very classical style, very academic style, but most of the people who were watching this might have a hard time understanding it because they're just everyday people. And so in between, you would have someone come out and like a narrator almost and re-explain what is going on, but using kind of everyday speech. So rather than speaking in these like highfalutin, highly academic terms, they would come out and speak to you as if you were just talking on the street with a friend. And I thought that's kind of interesting because if we think back again to the prior era, we know that China was conquering all sorts of different territory, and the people who lived in those places had different dialects, had different languages that they spoke, and so I thought this was kind of an interesting way to try to unite all those people and bring them under one one umbrella together, is to have these explanatory pieces in between. And then we're going to jump over to Latin America. In South America and Latin America at this time, this was thought of as the colonial period. So by the 16th century, the Spanish and the Portuguese had begun to colonize Latin America, and it was a scourge on the continent. I mean, you had these other societies and the other cultures bringing in disease and firearms and just conquering huge swaths of 15th century, 16th century Latin America. They brought with them, as they came from Spain and Portugal, they brought with them Roman Catholic religious music to the New World. Gregorian chant and Spanish sacred polyphony entered the repertoire. Numerous Catholic devotional songs were translated into native language, An Iberian medieval church theater with its affiliated dances and songs were introduced to the native populations. So we see this kind of happening where the Spanish and the Portuguese bring over, what their tradition was at the time that they left, and they, try to convert everyone to their religion, and then they try to tell them, the good news of the gospel after they've just, killed all the dissenters and the people who didn't agree with them. And they said, okay, here's your new religion. But as you can imagine, this is like a whole different world, and this is from a very different tradition. And these people, it A, might not be very appealing to them, but B, they're probably having a hard time understanding who's this guy Jesus, and why does he matter to me? And so what many of the priest or the friars did, who were running these churches in the New World, as they thought of it, the New World, they would try to convert the words into the language that the people spoke there in Latin America and the different parts. They would try to convert the dances that were traditional European dances into dances that were more likened to what the people had already been doing before they arrived. And then this way there was this like blending of these cultures. So presently, numerous dances with the religious subjects have become integral parts of folk tradition. And again, these are the blending of the native traditions that were already there and the traditions of the conquering people who came. The danzas de la conquista in Mexico and Guatemala, and the congados, or congados, in Brazil, the dances of the Congo. These dances continue to incorporate both indigenous and Christian elements. Although they have been more closely associated with native traditions, they've been performed since the early colonial period and were used by Catholic friars and priests, as I mentioned, as a method of converting these people. By the end of the 16th century, Spaniards had established cathedrals in all the major cities in their territory. They also founded universities and set up printing presses, which further cultivated the spread of European art music to the continent. And moving forward, we do see, in Brazil in particular, but all through Latin America, we do see a profligation of European styles of writing music. They begin to use the same 5-bar system that is being used in Europe. We begin to see the same sorts of styles being written and the same techniques being used. And as we get further into the classical period, once we're through the Baroque, so 2 periods from now, we'll see that the other European nations who are also playing this game of trying to conquer the world and grabbing up every square inch of land, that we begin to see even more blendings of island nation traditions with the traditions of the European nations. So here are our key terms, and I have some listening examples for you. This spans pretty much everything that was happening at the time with the Renaissance in Europe and China and Latin America as well. So I hope you guys enjoy that. If you have any questions, please reach out to me at kyle.berry at hdtc.edu. All right.